What about the little girl's claim? She said 2015, that's sort of silly. But people say we are going to run out. You suck the stuff out of the ground. And I've heard predictions about when we're going to run out for a long time.
The oil and natural gas that we rely on for 75% of our energy are simply running out.
Running out?
To believe that we're about to run out of crude oil is to believe that there will no longer be any technological innovations in production, that there will be no response to high price. I find that fairly hard to believe, and that's why we haven't run out yet.
I've been hearing it for years. President Carter is no dummy. Robert, what's...
I mean, the reality is, John, that the more oil we find, the more oil we find. Let's just look at the last 20 years. In 1990, U.S. proved oil reserves were about 34 billion barrels. By 2010, U.S. proved reserves were about 31 billion barrels. Those are reserves we know we can drill for and produce. Well, over that 20-year period, the U.S. produced over 50 billion barrels of oil. So the proved reserves well, again, the more oil we find, the more oil we find. And that's what we've found, well, because, as Jerry said, it's technological innovation. The combination of horizontal drilling, John, and hydraulic fracturing, which a lot of the environmentalists don't like, the reality is that this has resulted in an enormous amount of natural gas coming to the market, so much so that today natural gas is selling for about $2, $2.50. 4 years ago, it was selling for $10. This is a remarkable windfall for the U.S. economy. The hard reality is that the oil and gas sector has out-innovated the solar and wind sectors over the last 4 years, and they've done it in spades.
Yeah, they're spending their own money. That incentivizes them. And
it's a big incentive.
Next myth, Jerry, the oil companies are making disgusting profits. At our expense.
Well, it turns out that the average U.S. manufacturer makes about 8 cents of profit on every dollar's worth of earnings. The average oil and gas company makes about 6 cents of profits on every dollar's worth of earnings. Oil and gas companies actually don't do all that well, but they do post big numbers, right? We hear that ExxonMobil made $34 billion.
$9 billion this quarter. Exactly. Shell, $7 billion.
Yeah, well, it's relative to what? These are huge companies, and they're huge because, well, they sell a lot of product and they invest a lot. But relative to the size of their business, they're actually not particularly profitable industries to be in.
Next myth, where does our gasoline come from?
Where do we get most of our gas?
Out of the country?
I know it's not from America. From the Middle East.
India?
I'm not really sure. Probably Afghanistan?
Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Canada.
All right, he was getting closer at least. Robert, Canada, as you pointed out, we get a lot of oil from Canada, but we get most of it from America, right?
Well, U.S. oil production is increasing rapidly, and so is production from Brazil. So that when it comes to the future of U.S. oil use, a lot more of it is going to be coming from right here in the Western Hemisphere, Canada, U.S., Mexico, Brazil, and less from the Middle East.
So why don't people know this? Almost everybody I ask has no clue that most of it comes from the United States.
Because the policy world is obsessed with the Middle East. Conservatives like to argue that we need to be energy dependent so that we can have a foreign policy more to their liking that is disentangled from our reliance on Middle Eastern crude. Environmentalists want to scare us away from crude oil because they say, well, it's all coming from bad guys abroad and terrorists, and we don't want that. The reality is that 55% of our crude oil, more than half of it, comes from the United States. That's the #1 supplier. And of the imports that we get, 52% of them total, all imports, are from Canada and Mexico. The Persian Gulf countries are responsible for only about 10% of U.S. consumption.
But people think it all comes from Saudi Arabia.
Because this entire conversation is about the Middle East, the Middle East, the Middle East. The reality is they're a small contributor to U.S. refineries.
Now, what about green energy? That little girl talked about skateboards and bicycles, and, you know, she's a little girl, but we hear from adults that electric cars are better for the environment and good for America. Robert?
New York Times reporter wrote that the electric car has long been recognized as the ideal solution because it is cleaner than gasoline-fueled cars. A century of failure tailgating failure. Why do we use gasoline? Because gasoline has 80 times the energy density of the best lithium-ion batteries. Why didn't electric cars catch on in Edison's day? Because batteries were lousy. Today, batteries are still lousy. They're too heavy, they're too finicky, and they cost too much. And that's why we use gasoline. It's why we use diesel fuel, because it's an incredibly energy-dense, flexible, easy-to-use product.
And the other hype about the electric car is it's better for the earth.
Well, if you think that coal's better for the earth, then fine. But I mean, that's where most of our electricity comes from. It comes from coal-fired power plants. It's pretty hard to make an argument that coal and natural gas, an aggregate on the grid, are less polluting than the gasoline out of the cars. It's kind of a wash.
And even the environmentalists have now come around to say, okay, electric car is not so great.